This is Chapter 8, Supporting Ideas. So this chapter explains more about using evidence and research to support your subpoints. Just like subpoints support your main points, your supporting ideas support your subpoints. And support is defined as the range of strategies a public speaker can use to develop the central idea and specific purpose by providing corroborating evidence. And so why do we need support? Why do I have to do this? Well, a lot of reasons. First, to clarify the content. Definitions are one way to clarify ideas. Description is another way. You also need to enhance speaker credibility, and you do this through support. Adequate support from reliable sources is essential, and you don't want to distort any information in order to make a point, because that's unethical. The accuracy of your support sources is crucial because it needs to agree with other expert sources. For example, the way which statistics are derived and the meaning of the statistic must be clear because then it shows it's accurate, it shows it's clear, easy to understand. The information within that statistic should also be consistent with other sources, and the statistic should just make logical sense. And statistic is very hard to say repeatedly. Also, with speaker credibility, authority or expertise is more than just creating a perception of expertise. You have to be careful accepting sources as authoritative. An expert has an appropriate degree, training, or certification that makes him or her an expert, and that expert is widely acknowledged as an authority. Celebrity status alone is not enough to show that a source is credible, qualified, or authoritative. Also with credibility, currency is another consideration in support. So the information shouldn't be out of date. Some kinds of information undergo major changes throughout even short periods of time. And some theories also become discredited when new research comes out. So you want your support to be current as well. And objectivity also means that the information is impartial. So some information is well-researched, tested, unbiased, and logical. However, even biased research attempts to base its findings on some logic. So it can be kind of tricky to determine if something's biased or not. Bias is a predisposition that prevents impartiality. Unbiased sources represent ideas fairly. Unbiased sources do not frame their opinions as logical and sensible. They have more than websites to express their views. They use experts. Unbiased sources honestly disclose who they are, and unbiased sources have no political, religious, or financial interest in the views they express. They don't differ radically from the views of other experts either. And so you can see why it's really important to use unbiased sources versus biased sources. So with your support, you want them to be current, credible, and comprehensive. Those are the three big C's. Current, you want it to be up to date. Credible, you want it to be made by an expert, someone that you believe. And comprehensive, meaning it's unbiased. It's showing both sides of an issue if there are two sides. It's showing really objective. So current, credible, and comprehensive. We also need support to make a speech more vivid. And vividness refers to a speaker's ability to present information in a striking, exciting manner. It makes a speech easier for listeners to remember and just makes a speech more interesting. So we have a lot of different types of support. First are facts and statistics. Fact is a truth arrived at through the scientific process. And then statistics are mathematical expressions of fact based on analyses and interpretations of collected data. A lot of our realities in life are governed by statistics. So medical decisions are based on odds, usually. Budgeting, based on statistics. School funding, anything like that. However, statistics are often used and misused. People are impressed by numbers. We love numbers. Unfortunately, we don't always know how to interpret them, or people use statistics to mislead others. And so you want to avoid misusing statistics. You want to be honest, avoid distorting statistics, or omitting important stats that don't agree with your argument. Do some basic calculations also to see if a stat is reasonable to avoid, and this is to avoid such errors like decimal errors, percentage errors. Sometimes errors happen in reports, and so you just kind of want to double check or see if that number's feasible. Like if somebody said 9 trillion people in the world did this. Do we have 9 trillion people in the world right now? So just a little basic calculation, a little logic. And you also want to evaluate your statistical sources using, accuracy, authority, currency, objectivity, the things we just talked about. The second type of support are the definitions as evidence. And definitions are effective in just kind of making sure everyone's on the same page with what a word means, and that way everyone can also understand your meanings. We have a few different types of definitions you can use. The first is lexical, and these are definitions that specify how words are used in a language. And so if a word has a lot of different meanings, the speaker should specify which sense of the word is being used. A lot of times with communication studies, we have words wherein how we use them every day is not what we mean in communication studies. So if we think of attraction, and I say, oh, you're attracted to your friends, you might think, I'm not attracted to my friends. No. But we do have an attraction. It might be a task attraction. We're attracted to how hard of a worker they are. We might be attracted to them socially, like we think they're funny. So you are attracted to your friends, I hope. Otherwise, you shouldn't be friends with them. And so that's just an example of the lexical definition. A persuasive definition can also be used, and these are designed to motivate an audience to think in a particular way. Unpopular ideas are often framed in a way to appeal to an unquestioning audience. And so you might, if in the abortion debate, you are pro-life, or you're pro-choice, and you might call them anti-abortionists. You might have sort of these heavy words that you throw around because you know that the persuasive definition that goes along with them is really strong and evokes the emotional response. So that's the persuasive definition. We also might use simulative, and these are definitions assigned to a word by the person who coined it for the first time. So whoever made up the word gets to define it and say, this is exactly what it is. And then the fourth definition is theoretical. And these are definitions used to describe all parts related to a particular type of idea. They can be ambiguous because they sometimes try to describe all possible permutations of what's going on. So an example of a term with a theoretical definition would be falling in love. And so it's theoretical, it's sort of abstract, but if you just want to state, like, here's what I mean by this, you sort of make it as concrete as you can so the audience knows what you're talking about. Another type of support are examples as evidence, and these are useful because they can make an abstract idea more concrete. We have positive examples, so they clarify or illustrate a principle, method, phenomenon, and they offer a positive method of how it should be done. So it's like, this is a book. This is definitely my book. This is an example of a book. A negative example illustrates what should not be done. This is not a book. This is not a book. And then a non-example, that would be a non-example, example of what something is not. This is not a book. It helps the audience differentiate between things. So negative example would be like, this is how you hold a book. This is not how you hold a book. This is how you hold a book. Now don't do it like this. That's a negative example. A non-example is saying, this is not what it is. Okay, sorry for the confusion, my bad. So non-example helps you differentiate between two things, whereas a negative example illustrates what should not be done. They're very similar, but they're not the same. Then we have best examples, and these examples are held as the very best way someone should behave within that specific context. They illustrate appropriate behavior, but these examples are less effective when the case is perceived as being rare, because it might be the only example, and so people think, well, you're not being comprehensive. You're just providing one little very rare example of what's going on. Another type of support would be narratives as evidence. These help an audience understand the speaker's message. It's similar to a little story told to clarify meanings. And you do have an ethical responsibility to disclose if your narrative is real or hypothetical. If it's real, it has to be completely accurate. Or you could create a hypothetical narrative to kind of draw your listeners in, but then you have to tell them this is made up, this is completely hypothetical. We have informative narratives that provide information or explanations. We also have persuasive narratives, and these help persuade people to accept or reject a specific attitude, belief, value, or behavior. And then we have the entertaining narrative. And these are designed to delight an audience and transport them from their daily concerns. So these are just like interesting. I'm just telling a story for the sake of telling a story. And we do this daily in conversation. We're constantly telling people stories. We're constantly engaging in entertaining narratives. So then another type of evidence would be testimony as evidence. And this is an expert opinion or account of direct witnesses that provide support for you. Expert testimony expresses attitudes, values, beliefs, behaviors recommended by someone who is an acknowledged expert on a topic. If you have credentials, if you have a degree, if you have a certain job title, you have this expert signification so that you can be an expert on that topic. We also have eyewitness testimony as a type of testimony, obviously. It's given by someone who has direct contact with that phenomenon. It can be a little tricky because you're relying on someone else's account, so it's sort of a secondhand account that you're giving to your audience. And such testimony might also be incomplete. You know, maybe the witness only saw a portion of what's going on. Giving detail about the witness and the circumstances under which they observed the event is also helpful. Like, this person saw the traffic accident, but she was also babysitting and trying to keep track of that, and it was kind of dark out, and so you want to provide all those circumstances. Another type of support are the analogies as evidence, and these are figures of speech that compare two ideas or objects, showing how they're similar. Figurative analogies compare two ideas or objects from two different classes or groups of objects or ideas sharing common characteristics. Very figurative. These can be a problem when people see the comparison as a stretch and they're weaker. These types of analogies are weaker than solid evidence. They are helpful in describing and helping your audience understand them, but they're not a solid form of evidence. Literal analogies do compare two objects or ideas that clearly belong to the same class, and audiences are more able to readily see that comparison. So if you're talking about two objects that belong to the same class, so like magazines and newspapers, they're pretty similar. So if you're comparing the newspaper industry to the magazine industry, it's not a huge stretch. They are different. They have different models, but we can kind of see how they're related. Next, we'll talk about how we use, support, and create arguments. An argument is defined as a set of organized logical premises that lead to conclusions. So a premise is a statement designed to provide support or evidence, and I'll give you an example in a second. A conclusion, then, is a statement that can be clearly drawn from the provided premise or premises. And then we have to provide support for those premises as well. So an example, premise 1, eating fast food has been linked to childhood obesity. Premise 2, childhood obesity is clearly linked to early onset type 2 diabetes, which can have many negative health ramifications. Conclusion, therefore, for children to avoid developing early onset type 2 diabetes, they should have their fast food intake limited. Very clear-cut, good, solid premises. Now, you do have to be ethical and logical when making these arguments. I'll give an example of an argument that's logically pretty okay, but it doesn't make sense, and so ethically it shouldn't follow. Premise 1, ice cream sales increased in July. and you can provide statistics that support that. Premise 2, breaking and entering crimes increase in July, and you could provide statistical support for that as well. So the erroneous conclusion then is that an increase in ice cream sales leads to more crime in July. And you know that that's not what it is. Ice cream doesn't lead to crime, but statistically speaking, this goes up and this goes up, so they must be correlated. Correlations are not causations. So just be ethical, be aware. Next, in terms of deciding on support, you want to make your speech more credible and interesting than just overloading your speech with evidence. So you want to use a lot of variety. And different audience members are likely to have different preferences for support. And so you want to use different combinations. And you want to choose those based on your specific audience, your topic, and your specific purpose. Support should be directly relevant to the premises supported. And you do need to be selective about the evidence you use, rather than just trying to fit as much in as humanly possible. You want to pick the best evidence and a variety of evidence. If you twist your evidence to fit your own needs, it's unethical. It's called support manipulation. Not good, not good. So there's a lot of do's and don'ts with this that the text lists, and it's really important to know all of those as well. Basically, you just really want to make sure you're clearly citing all of your evidence, not jumping to conclusions, and just being ethical and thorough with your evidence. With different types of support, we have direct quotations as one. And this is when speaker A uses the exact wording by a speaker or writer. You want to use a direct quotation if the original author's words are witty, engaging, distinct, or particularly vivid. You want to also use a direct quotation if you want to highlight an expert and his or her expertise, or if you want to specifically analyze something said within the quotation. You know, if your analysis depends on exact wording, you definitely want to use the exact quotation then. Keep quotations to a minimum though. One of the biggest mistakes people make is stringing quotation, quotation, quotation. Same thing in writing. Don't just go quotation, quotation, quotation. You'll want to paraphrase, which we talk about next. The last thing with quotations, keep them short if you can. If there's a snippet in the middle while it's still maintaining the general idea of the quote, just use that snippet. You don't need the whole long quotation at that point. Next is paraphrasing. And this is taking a general idea from someone and condensing the idea or theme in your own words. Dropping or rearranging a few words from a direct quotation is not paraphrasing. So to paraphrase, you do it when you can say things more concisely than the original author, when the exact wording won't improve your audience's understanding. Sometimes direct quotes have a lot of big words, a lot of jargon. So if you can put it into easy to understand words, that would be a good time to paraphrase. You also want to paraphrase when you want to adapt an example, analogy, or narrative, and just make its relevance more evident. So you kind of change the example around and just put it in your own words. Well, that's what paraphrasing is, but when you want to adapt things. And you also want to paraphrase information that's not likely to be questioned by your audience. So things that are kind of evident. If you think it's going to be questioned, then yeah, use the direct quotation. Summaries are another great way to condense information. It's condensing a text as a form of support. And you summarize when you need another speaker's complete argument to make your argument understood. You summarize when explaining possible counter-arguments to the ones posed. You might also summarize when you need to cite a lot of different sources effectively and efficiently to support your argument. So if you have a book, a whole book that supports what you're saying, you might just want to summarize the book. Find a way to have a nice 2-sentence summary of what was talked about, the basics of what the book talked about, or the basics of what an article talked about. That's a good way to summarize. Numeric support is something else that you might want to use. This is the use of numbers, data, stats within a speech. You do need to make sure your audience can accurately interpret those numbers, and we talked about that earlier. Clearly state the numbers and where they came from. Make sure you explain what the numbers mean and how they should be interpreted. So 50% of all people don't wear their seatbelts. What this means is that half of everybody who gets into a car can be thrown out of the car if they're in a crash because they're not seatbelted in. Something like that. Just a little explanation of what those numbers actually mean. And if the numbers are overly complicated, you might want to consider turning all those stats into a visual aid, which brings you to the next type of support, which is pictographic support, which I love a good picture. I love a good infographic. And this is support drawn from visual representations of an object or process. You should use this when it's easier and shorter than orally explaining an entire process. You don't want to say step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. If you can just throw a picture up behind you on a PowerPoint or a Prezi where it shows how one thing leads to the next, that would be much easier and much more time efficient than going through everything step by step and explaining it if a picture can do it better than you. You also want to do this when you really want to emphasize the importance of the support. So maybe this is from a particular source that's solid and expert. You do want to make sure that the pictographic support is aesthetically pleasing. Make sure it looks nice. And it should be easy to understand. And again, it should take less time to use than words alone. And you want to make sure everybody can easily see your pictographic support. Can they all see it? Is it big enough? Did you just take a little thumbnail and blow it up and now it's all pixely? You want it to be clear and easily seen. Next, we'll talk about determining the right amount of support. You can use reverse outlines. This is just, you start with the speaker's conclusion and logically work backwards to see if the support is appropriate and comprehensive. By forcing yourself to think in reverse, you're more likely to see the missteps along the way because you're not just kind of skipping over it like, oh, everybody understands that. So if you start at step 5 and go backward, you can better see the logic and if there's any confusion with the logic. With supporting claims, you want to make sure every claim you make is supported with some sort of evidence. And the evidence you cite should actually agree with your claim. You don't want to provide counter information that contradicts what you're saying. That would not be useful. We do have 3 steps to orally support, to an oral, 3 steps to oral support presentation. Okay, so the first step in your oral support in your presentation is the setup. And this is the sentence or phrase where you explain where the information you are going to tell them is from. It includes the name of the source, the location of the source, date, name of the author if there is one, identification or expertise level of the author. So for example, you might say, according to Melanie Smithfield, in an article titled Do It Right or Do It Now, published in the June 18th, 2009 issue of Time magazine, and then you give your information. Or according to Jocelyn de Groot in an article titled I Love Public Speaking, published in the June 21st, 2015 edition of SIUE magazine, said, and go on from there. The second step is the execution. This is actually reading the quotation, paraphrasing the speaker author's words, summarizing those ideas, providing numerical support, or showing the pictographic evidence. So any of those things that we just talked about, that's where this evidence goes. It should be seamless, it should flow easily, which means you need to practice citing your source and providing this evidence during your rehearsals. And then the third step is the analysis of support. This is where you explain to the audience how you should interpret the support provided. You want to summarize the support in your own words after you give it. Specifically tell your audience how it relates to the argument. And this might be like, so you can see here, and then draw the conclusion. And you want to draw a sensible conclusion based on your support. You don't want to leave the audience hanging. You don't want to assume that your audience is dumb or stupid, but you also don't want to assume that they can draw the lines between your evidence and your claim either. You want to say, okay, so you can see that this supports the notion that you should always wear your seatbelt when you're in the car. That'd be one good way to do it. So that is a lot of information from Chapter 8 on supporting ideas, and you'll need to use this information for your informative, your persuasive, and your group presentation.